Meg Calder owned exactly three things that still worked: a duffel bag held together with duct tape, a pair of hiking boots with the left sole peeling off, and a stubbornness that had outlasted 2 careers, 1 busted knee, and the entire public school system of Tucson, Arizona. The stubbornness was the reason she was standing in a hallway that smelled like recycled air and burned copper, 600 million miles from the nearest Starbucks, reading a contract on a tablet that kept auto-translating her name into a series of clicking sounds. Helix 9 was not what the recruitment brochure had promised. The brochure had shown wide corridors bathed in soft light, smiling humans shaking appendages with colorful aliens, and a tagline that read, "Bridge cultures, build futures." The actual station looked like someone had welded a hospital to the inside of a tin can and then forgotten to install windows. The light was the pale green of a gas station bathroom at 2 in the morning, and the only culture Meg had encountered so far was the bacterial kind growing in the cracks of the docking bay floor. But broke was broke, and broke with a specialty degree in early childhood education and no school willing to hire her, was a particular flavor of broke that tasted like expired ramen and landlord voicemails. So when the Galactic Cooperative's Family Services Division had posted a 2-year contract for a Xeno nursery attendant, housing included, hazard pay included, dental not included, but honestly, when was dental ever included? Meg had signed it before the ink was dry. Her supervisor was a Keth named Vaughn. The Keth were insectoid, roughly 8 feet tall, with segmented limbs that moved in ways that made Meg's brain want to file a complaint with her eyes. Vaughn's head was triangular. His mandibles clicked when he was thinking, and he had the general energy of a middle school vice principal who had seen too much and slept too little. "Your assignment," Vaughn said, leading her down the corridor, "is the overflow nursery. Cubs, hatchlings, and larvae from diplomatic families currently in closed-session negotiations." "Larvae," Meg repeated. "The Belori produce larval young, yes. They require a humidity-controlled substrate and minimal interaction. You will find them low maintenance." "Great. Love low maintenance." "Your first charges, however," Vaughn continued, and something in the way his mandibles stopped clicking told Meg the easy part of the conversation was over, "are the Draelith delegation's 3 cubs." He pulled up a file on his tablet and handed it to her. 3 faces stared back at her, if faces was the right word for arrangements of bone plate, fangs, and eyes that glowed faintly amber, like coals buried in ash. The eldest, Koth, had a jaw that could fit around her entire head. The middle one, Sayri, had the flat, still expression of something that watched you from tall grass. The youngest, Ven, was smaller than the other 2, his plates not fully hardened, his eyes slightly too large for his skull. The file listed their species stats. Average adult height, 7 feet. Average adult weight, 400 pounds. Homeworld gravity, 1.6 Earth standard. Primary communication, sub-bass vocalization, and dominance display. Dietary classification, apex predator, obligate carnivore. The cubs were the developmental equivalent of human 5-year-olds. They had claws. They had fangs. They weighed about 90 pounds each. "Do they bite?" Meg asked. Vaughn's mandibles clicked once, twice. "They have not killed a caretaker yet. Yet. The word is accurate." Meg scrolled through the rest of the file. 3 previous caretakers had been assigned to the Draelith cubs during this rotation. The first, a Pelori, had lasted 4 hours before requesting a medical transfer after what the report described as sustained acoustic trauma. The second, a Gren, had made it 2 days before the cubs figured out that Gren stress molt when frightened, and spent an afternoon chasing the poor creature around the nursery, collecting shed scales like trophies. The third caretaker, another Keth, had simply not shown up for the second shift, and was later found in a supply closet, mandibles locked in what Vaughn delicately described as a stress configuration. "So I'm the 4th option," Meg said. "You are the only remaining option," Vaughn corrected. The nursery staff rotation is exhausted. You are new. You are human. And humans are, he paused, searching for the diplomatic phrasing. Humans are not yet fully understood by most species on this station. The Draelith have not encountered your kind in a caregiving context. There is a possibility that novelty alone will buy you time. Novelty, Meg said. You're sending me in because they haven't figured out how to break me yet. Vaughn considered this. That is a more honest summary, yes. The nursery was at the end of the corridor. A heavy door with a viewing panel. Meg looked through the glass. The 3 cubs were inside. Koth was standing on a table he had flipped onto its side, roaring at something in the corner. Sari was crouched on the floor, motionless, watching the door with those flat, cataloging eyes. Ven sat apart from both of them, near the far wall, small and quiet, his sleeping mat positioned next to the emergency exit. Meg's chest did something. A squeeze, a recognition. The one who made himself small. She knew that kid. She had taught 30 versions of that kid in classrooms with broken ceiling tiles and not enough chairs. She looked at Vaughn. What's their parents' deal? Commander Raylos and Consul Thyan. Senior military and diplomatic figures. They are, another mandible pause. They are not optimistic about your assignment. They think I'm going to get eaten. Commander Raylos used a phrase that roughly translates to, feeding the soft thing to the children for entertainment. Consul Thyan did not disagree. Meg handed the tablet back. She tightened the strap on her duffel bag, the one she had retaped that morning because the buckle had finally surrendered to gravity and age, and the general principle that nothing in Meg Calder's life held together without intervention. Open the door, she said. His compound eyes reflected her face back at her in fractured mosaic. 100 tiny Megs, all of them tired, all of them broke, all of them walking into a room full of apex predator children because the alternative was going home. And home was a word that had stopped meaning what it used to mean, somewhere around last October. He opened the door. Meg stepped through. Inside the nursery, Koth stopped roaring. 3 pairs of amber eyes locked onto her. This small, soft, clawless thing that smelled like recycled air and coffee, and something the cubs had no name for. She set her duffel bag down, unzipped it, pulled out a box of crayons she had packed in Tucson because some habits die harder than funding for public education. All right, she said, to the 3 children who could kill her. The crayons bought her 11 minutes. 11 minutes of Koth staring at the box like it might be a trap. Sari creeping closer in slow increments that were either curiosity or a hunting approach. Hard to tell with a species whose play behavior and predatory behavior use the same body language. And Ven watching from his spot by the door, his 2 big eyes tracking the colors like someone watching a fire from a safe distance. Then Koth decided the testing period was over. He stepped off the flip table. He crossed the nursery floor in 3 heavy strides, each footfall landing with the solid thud of something built for a world where gravity was personal. He stopped 2 feet from Meg. He was eye level with her, which was wrong for a 5-year-old by any species standard, and extremely wrong for Meg's cardiovascular system. His plates, those iridescent chitinous panels that covered his skull, shoulders, and spine, began to rattle, a dry, percussive sound, like stones being shaken in a leather bag. The rattle was a warning. The file had been clear about that. Rattling plates meant a dominance display was coming, and a dominance display from a Draelith cub was not a symbolic gesture. It was a bioacoustic event. Koth opened his mouth. The roar hit Meg like a wall of sound given physical weight. 140 decibels of sub-bass vibration that she did not hear so much as feel. In her teeth, in her ribs, in the soft tissue behind her eyes. The frequency carried pheromone markers, chemical signals designed over millions of years of evolution to tell every prey species within range A single, clear message. Run. Meg's body got the message. Her legs wanted to go. Her hands wanted to cover her face. Every ancient thing in her hindbrain, every leftover scrap of Savannah firmware that still ran underneath her modern operating system, was screaming at her to flee, to cower, to make herself small, and hope the predator lost interest. Her ears rang. Something warm ran down the left side of her neck. Blood, she realized distantly. The burst had ruptured something small in her ear canal. She did not run. She stood there, hands shaking at her sides, blood on her collar, and stared at Koth with the same expression she had used on a boy named Danny Reeves in her second year of teaching. The morning Danny had picked up a plastic chair and thrown it at her head, because his father had picked up something heavier the night before, and Danny had nowhere else to put what that felt like. Koth roared again. Sayri joined him. Her roar was different, higher, sharper, a harmonic that layered on top of Koth's bass like a second blade finding the gap in armor. Together, they produced a sound that made the nursery lights flicker and sent Meg's vision white at the edges. Then, the smallest, his contribution was less a roar and more a shriek, high-pitched, thin, vibrating at a frequency that found Meg's fillings and tried to rattle them loose. It was the weakest of the three, and he knew it, and he threw it out anyway, with the desperate energy of the smallest kid on the playground, trying to prove he belonged in the fight. 3 Dreolith cubs, roaring in her face. The combined sound pressure was enough to make the nursery monitoring system flag the room for a potential injury event. Somewhere down the corridor, Vaughn's tablet chimed. He started moving. Meg's hands were shaking, her ears were bleeding, her knees wanted to buckle, not from the sound, but from the chemical cocktail the pheromones had dumped into her bloodstream, adrenaline and cortisol and something older than both. She looked at Koth, at Sayri, at Fen, the smallest, roaring his thin little roar with everything he had. She opened her mouth. What came out was not a Dreolith roar. She did not have the anatomy for that. No resonating plates, no sub-bass vocal architecture, no pheromone glands. What she produced was something else entirely. A sound from the diaphragm, from the gut, from the place below conscious thought, where the body stores the things the mind refuses to carry. It was a bellow. A raw, full-throated, unmusical explosion of air and vibration that had nothing to do with dominance displays and everything to do with 7 years of underfunded classrooms, a busted knee that ached when it rained, a phone call last October that she still could not think about without the room going sideways, and the simple, furious refusal to be the 4th caretaker who walked out of this room beaten by children. It bounced off the metal walls and came back at her, and she kept going, kept pushing air, kept making the sound that had no translation in any species' behavioral lexicon, because it was not a threat display and it was not a distress call. It was something humans did that the galaxy had not yet catalogued, the noise a person makes when they are done being afraid and have decided to be something else instead. She ran out of air, stopped. Silence. Koth's mouth was still open, but nothing was coming out. His plates had gone flat against his skull, not a submission posture, the file would later confirm, but a confusion posture. His threat model had expected 2 outcomes, flight or collapse. He had received neither. Sayri's eyes were wide, wider than Meg had seen them. The flat, cataloging stillness was gone, replaced by something that looked, in the low green light of the nursery, remarkably like surprise. Then was the one who moved first. He stopped shrieking. He closed his mouth. He looked at Meg, at her shaking hands, her bleeding ear, her heaving chest, her absolute refusal to be anywhere other than exactly where she was standing. And he walked across the nursery floor and pressed his body against her leg. The weight of him, warm, solid, 90 pounds of alien child leaning into her like a boat finding a dock. Koth sat down. Not a choice. His legs just folded, the way a dog sits when the fight drains out of it, and what remains is just a confused animal, trying to figure out what happened to the world it understood. Sayri's plates flattened entirely. She lowered herself to the floor, belly down, chin on her front claws, a watching posture. The predator, who had decided the new thing in the room was worth studying rather than testing. Meg looked down at Ven, at the warm weight against her bad knee. His plates were softer than the others, not fully hardened, and in the gaps between them his skin was a pale, almost translucent blue, and she could feel his heartbeat through the thin places, rapid and small and alive. Her hand moved on its own, settled on the back of his neck, the soft place between the plates. Her throat did something that was not a roar, and was not a word, and was not a sound she had made since last October. Down the corridor, Vaughn arrived at the viewing panel. He looked through the glass and saw a human woman standing in a nursery, with blood on her collar, and a Drelith cub pressed against her leg, and two more sitting on the floor, in what his behavioral training could only classify as deference to an unrecognized authority. His mandibles clicked again. He did not open the door. By evening, the monitoring footage had been flagged, copied, and shared across 3 department servers. A Pelori diplomat watched it in the commissary, and set down her meal with trembling wing hands. "Is the human broken?" she asked the Keth officer beside her, "or is she a predator?" The Keth officer watched Meg on the screen, small, soft, bleeding, unbowed, and said nothing, because neither answer fit, and the Keth did not have a word for the third thing she might be. Neither, it turned out, did anyone else. Meg figured out the cubs the same way she had figured out every classroom she had ever walked into, not from the manual, but from the watching. Koth roared too much. That was the first thing. A roar every time he entered the room. A roar when Sayri touched his food tray. A roar when Ven got too close. A roar at the walls, the ceiling, the recycled air. Koth roared the way some kids talk too loud in the cafeteria, not because they had something to say, but because the silence scared them more than the noise. Meg had seen it 100 times in Tucson. The kid who swung first, yelled first, broke things first, because being the threat was easier than being the target. Koth was the eldest. In Drelith hierarchy, the eldest cub was responsible for the survival of the younger ones, and that responsibility started at an age when a human child was still trying to figure out shoelaces. Koth was 5, and already carrying weight that would bend an adult. She started small, gave him the meal packs to hand out, a job, a role that was his. Let him choose the order of activities each morning. When he roared, she did not flinch, and she did not roar back. She just waited. Waited the way you wait out a thunderstorm, not fighting it, just being present on the other side of it, until the noise ran out of fuel, and what remained was a boy who was tired of being loud, but did not know how to stop. On the 3rd day, she taught him what she called inside voice. Not a whisper, not silence, a low, controlled rumble, using the same vocal architecture as a full dominance roar, but pulled back, held steady, shaped into something that communicated presence without aggression. Meg could not produce the sound herself, but she could demonstrate the principle. She hummed, a low, steady note, from her chest. Koth watched her, head tilted, plates half raised in confusion, and then he tried it. The sound he made was extraordinary, a subsonic purr that vibrated through the floor, and up through Meg's boots, and into her damaged left ear, where it settled like warm water. Koth looked startled by his own voice. He had not known it could do that. 5 years old, and he had never been shown that his body was capable of a sound that was not a weapon. By the end of the week, his roaring had dropped by half. He still did it, still puffed and rattled when Sayri beat him to the building blocks, still let loose a full-volume blast when the food dispenser jammed. But the frequency was changing. He was choosing. And choice, Meg knew, was the whole game. Everything else was just getting a kid to the point where choosing was possible. Sayri was different. She moved through the nursery like smoke, always peripheral, always still when you looked directly at her, always in motion when you turned away. She did not roar. She did not compete with Koth. She did not play with Ven. She observed, filed, catalogued. Meg recognized this too. The quiet kid in the back row who drew in the margins of every worksheet and never raised their hand and knew more about the social dynamics of the classroom than the teacher did. On the second day, Meg had left the crayon box open on the floor. Not offered, not presented, just open, available. Sayri had circled it for an hour before picking one up, the deep red one the color of old rust, and drawing on the smooth floor panel beside the wall. The drawing was not what Meg expected. It was precise, geometrically complex, a series of interlocking shapes that Meg initially took for abstract patterns until she tilted her head and realized she was looking at the station's corridor layout, rendered from above, accurate to a degree that suggested Sayri had mapped the entire section in her head during the walks between the nursery and her family's quarters. Meg said nothing about the drawing's quality, did not praise it, did not analyze it, did not make Sayri perform her ability for validation. She simply pulled the drawing off the floor when it was done, pinned it to the nursery wall with a strip of adhesive tape, and moved on. The next morning, there were 3 more drawings waiting. Sayri pretended she had not made them. Meg pinned them up without comment. By the end of the week, the nursery wall was a gallery. Star maps, anatomical studies of insects Sayri had seen in the station's biodome. A portrait of Koth mid-roar that captured the exact angle of his jaw with a fidelity that made Meg's breath catch. And one drawing, tucked in the corner, small, almost hidden, a figure with no plates and no claws, sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding something bright in its hands. Meg did not ask about that one either. She pinned it up with the rest. Then there was Ven. Ven was the problem. Not the loud kind of problem. The quiet kind. The kind that ate itself. He was small, smaller than a Dralith cub should be at his developmental stage, his plates thinner, his voice weaker, his mass maybe 2/3 of Koth's. In the wild, on the Dralith homeworld, a runt was a calculation. Resources were finite. A cub who could not keep pace with the pack was a cub the jungle would take, and the pack would mourn but not slow down. It was not cruelty. It was math. And Ven had already absorbed that math into his bones. He played alone. He ate last. He slept by the door, the emergency exit, the position farthest from the center, the spot where the expendable member of the group placed themselves, so that if a predator breached the room, it would take the least valuable member first, and give the others time to escape. Ven slept by the door because he believed at 5 years old that his purpose was to be eaten, so his siblings could live. Meg moved his mat to the center of the room on the 4th morning. She did not explain, did not give a speech, just picked up the mat while Ven watched her with those 2 large eyes, carried it to the middle of the nursery floor, and set it down between Koth's mat and Sayri's mat, in the protected center where the most valued member of the pack was supposed to sleep. Then stared at the mat, then at Meg, then back at the mat. His plates did a thing she had not seen before. A rapid, fluttering vibration, almost too fast to see, that started at his shoulders and ran down his spine. The file did not describe this behavior. Meg did not know what it meant. She would learn later that it was the Dralith physiological response to a reality that did not match the one the body had prepared for. The closest human equivalent was the feeling of stepping off a staircase and finding one more step than expected. The lurch, the recalibration, the moment where the world rearranges itself around a new fact. Ven slept in the center that night. He did not move back to the door. Meg introduced the games on the 5th day. Human games, modified. Tag. But played in teams. The concept of a team being something she had to physically demonstrate by taking Ven's hand and Koth's claw and running together, 3 bodies moving as one unit. Because the Dralith had a word for ally and a word for rival, but no word for teammate. Building challenges with the modular station blocks. Towers, bridges, structures that required more than 2 hands, that could not be completed alone, that rewarded cooperation with height and complexity and the simple satisfaction of making something that stood. Capture the flag, simplified, restructured so that all 3 cubs had to work together to retrieve the prize. Meg's duffel bag, placed on the far side of the nursery, which the cubs had developed an inexplicable attachment to, possibly because it smelled like earth and duct tape and the ghost of instant coffee. They resisted at first. Dralith play was competition. You won or you lost. The winner ate first. The loser ate what was left. The idea that all 3 could win the same game at the same time by helping each other struck them as structurally unsound, like being told that gravity was optional. But Meg was patient. Meg had survived parent-teacher conferences where fathers with neck tattoos and outstanding warrants leaned across the table and told her she did not know what she was talking about. Meg had once managed a class of 30 during a tornado warning in a school that did not have a proper shelter. With nothing but a calm voice and a willingness to lie convincingly about how safe everyone was. 3 alien cubs with claws were not going to outlast her. On the 7th day, she watched Koth and Sari build a block fortress together, while Ven, positioned at the center, as Meg had quietly arranged, directed the architecture, pointing with one small claw at where each piece should go, his voice a thin, steady chirp that his siblings followed without question. Meg sat on the floor and watched them build. Her bad knee ached. Her left ear still rang from the first day. The crayons were scattered across the floor in a constellation of color that no one had cleaned up, because she had learned that Sari liked to find them where she left them. Her tablet chimed. A message from her sister Lizzie, back on Earth. 4 words. How are you really? Meg typed, good, busy, talk soon. She put the tablet down, sat in the supply closet for 4 minutes, came back. Koth had added a turret to the fortress. Sari was drawing the fortress as it was being built. Ven was asleep in the center of the room, on his mat, in the spot where the most valued member of the pack was supposed to be. Meg sat down beside him and said nothing. The Varani Syndicate's trade attaché was named Seth, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been designed by a committee whose only instruction was, make it forgettable. Reptilian, scaled in matte gray-green, with a thin mouth that stayed in a permanent line of practiced neutrality. He was not tall. He was not imposing. He sat at the negotiation table the way a drop of oil sits on water, present, patient, and impossible to pin down. The closed session had been running for 3 hours when Seth decided to change the math. The trade dispute was about mining rights in the Keshara Belt, a stretch of mineral-rich asteroids that the Dralith had claimed by settlement and the Varani had claimed by contract. The kind of argument that had enough paperwork behind it to bury a small planet, and enough money at stake to start a war over. Both sides knew this. Both sides had brought their heaviest diplomatic weight. Commander Raylos sat on the Dralith side, 7 feet of armored fury, barely contained by a negotiation table. And the fact that he was here at all, a military commander at a trade talk, told the room everything it needed to know about how seriously the Dralith were taking the threat. Seth did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. What he did instead was worse. 3 hours into the session, during a pause in Consul Thyan's rebuttal of the Varani's territorial claim, Seth turned to the Dralith delegation and said, in a tone as flat and unremarkable as the rest of him, that it was admirable how the commander and the consul had brought their children to the station. Family, Seth said, was so important. Especially young family. Especially on a station where security, while admirable, was always a matter of— He paused, selecting the word the way a surgeon selects a blade. Probability. Nothing overt. Nothing actionable. No threat that any tribunal could point to and say, "There, that is the line that was crossed." Just a sentence that sat in the air between the two delegations, like a knife placed gently on a table, blade facing out. Thyan's claws stopped moving on her data tablet. Raylos stood up. When a Drelith commander stands, the room feels it before it sees it. The sub-bass vibration of 400 pounds of armored predator, rising from the seated position, travels through the floor, up through the furniture, and into the bodies of everyone present. 2 Varani aides physically recoiled. A Pelori observer left the room. Raylos crossed the space between his chair and Seth, in 2 strides. His hand, clawed, plated, capable of punching through a ship's hull at close range, closed around the edge of the table, 6 inches from Seth's face, and crushed it like paper. Seth did not flinch. His thin mouth did not move. His eyes, black and glossy as wet stone, looked up at Raylos with the patient emptiness of something that had already calculated every possible outcome of this moment, and found none of them threatening enough to warrant a change in expression. Thyan was on her feet, her hands on Raylos's arm, her voice in his ear, low, rapid, in the Drelith private frequency register that other species could not hear. Whatever she said worked, but only barely. Raylos released the table. The metal groaned. The session collapsed. The Drelith delegation left the room. The Varani remained. Seth adjusted his data tablet, which had not moved during the entire exchange, and made a note. Raylos walked the corridor to the nursery at a pace that made the station's deck plates vibrate. Thyan followed. 2 Drelith guards flanked them. The overhead lights flickered in time with Raylos's footsteps. Not a power issue, just the physical reality of something very heavy and very angry moving through a station built for lighter species. He reached the nursery, looked through the viewing panel. Inside, the room was quiet. The block fortress from 2 days ago had been expanded into something elaborate, a sprawling structure that took up half the floor, with arches and bridges and a central tower that listed slightly to the left. Koth was sitting beside the fortress, practicing his inside voice, that low, controlled rumble Meg had taught him, while pointing out structural weaknesses to Sayri, who was drawing a revised blueprint with a blue crayon. The wall behind them was covered in Sayri's art, a patchwork of maps and portraits and shapes that turned the bare metal into something that almost looked like it belonged to someone. And then was asleep, in Meg's lap. Meg sat cross-legged on the floor in the center of the room, her back against the wall, her bad knees stretched out, a datapad balanced on her right thigh with what looked like a supply requisition form. Ven was curled in her lap, his head tucked against her stomach, his 2 large eyes closed, his plates flat and still. One of Meg's hands rested on his back, on the soft place between his shoulder plates where the chitin had not fully hardened. The sight hit Raylos like something with mass. A Drelith cub asleep in the lap of another being. In his culture, sleep was the final vulnerability. You did not sleep touching someone unless you believed, not thought, not hoped, believed with the marrow-deep certainty that preceded language, that the person you were touching would die before they let anything reach you. Sleep was not trust. Sleep was surrender. The cub who slept in your arms had given you their life and expected you to hold it. Ven was asleep in the lap of a human, a clawless, plateless, 90-pound human with a bleeding ear and a duct-tape bag, and no biological reason to protect a Drelith runt from anything. Thyan arrived at his shoulder, looked through the glass. Her claws retracted, a reflex, involuntary, the body's response to the presence of recognized pack. She had not intended to do it. Her hands had made the decision without consulting her. Raylos opened the door. Meg looked up, read his face, or his plates, which amounted to the same thing once you learned to look. She saw what was under the fury, which was fear, which was worse. He told her, not gently, not diplomatically, not in any order that made strategic sense. He told her that a Varani trade attaché had implied a threat against his children, that the station's security was not sufficient, that he was pulling the cubs from the nursery effective immediately, and that this arrangement was finished. Meg looked at him, then was still asleep in her lap. Her hand had not moved from his back. "No," she said. One word, not loud, not a roar, just the word, delivered with the same calm, immovable certainty with which she had once told a school board that cutting the art program would happen over her professionally dead body. Raylos had faced warships. He had stood on the bridge of a destroyer during a reactor breach and given orders while the hull screamed. He had killed a Varani assassin with his bare claws in a corridor not unlike this one, 8 years ago, in a life he did not discuss. He faltered. "You pull them now," Meg said, "and you teach them that when something scary happens, you run." "Is that what you want Koth to learn?" "He just figured out he doesn't have to roar at everything. You want to undo that?" "The threat is real," Raylos said. "Then the nursery is where they should be. I already talked to Vaughn about the locks. I'm upgrading them tonight, and I will be here. I'm not going anywhere." "You are one human." Meg looked down at Ven, at the small sleeping weight that had chosen her lap out of every available surface in the room, that had walked away from the door where expendable things slept and come to rest in the center, against her, because she had moved his mat and he had decided to believe her. "Yeah," Meg said, "and your kid is asleep in my lap. So, either I'm doing something right, or your species threat assessment is broken." Behind Raylos, Thyan made a sound, low, short, bitten off. It might have been a laugh. It was the first sound she had ever directed at Meg that was not indifference. Raylos stood in the doorway for a long time. His plates cycled through colors Meg could not read, amber to deep bronze to something dark that she would later learn was the Drelith equivalent of a person closing their eyes and exhaling. He left the cubs. That night, after Raylos and Thyan were gone, after Koth and Sari had fallen asleep in their mats, flanking Ven's center position, Meg walked to the maintenance bay and requisitioned a heavy wrench, 4 extra lock bolts, and a can of industrial adhesive sealant rated for deck plate bonding. The supply officer, a bored Gren running the night shift, looked at the list and then at Meg. "Home improvement project," she said. She carried the supplies back to the nursery, installed the extra bolts on the door, set the wrench beside her chair in the corner, opened the can of adhesive sealant, and considered the floor inside the entrance, the 3-foot radius where someone would have to step if they came through the door. She did not apply the sealant yet. She set it on the shelf, within arm's reach. Then she pulled her chair to the corner with the best sightline on the door, sat down, wrapped herself in the emergency thermal blanket from the supply closet, and settled in to wait. She did not sleep. In the center of the room, Ven breathed. Small, steady, alive. They came on the 3rd night. Meg had slept a combined total of 9 hours across those 3 nights, gathered in shallow naps between rounds of checking the locks, checking the cubs, checking the corridor through the viewing panel. She ran on station coffee, a substance that tasted like someone had described coffee to a machine that had never encountered a bean, and something else, something that did not come from caffeine and did not have a name, a wakefulness that lived in the chest and refused to let the body do what the body wanted, which was collapse. Third shift. Station night cycle. The corridor lights dimmed to their lowest setting, casting everything in the gray-blue wash of artificial midnight. The nursery was quiet. Koff slept on his back, plates half raised even in sleep, the posture of a child who guarded himself against the world, even when the world was not looking. Sayri slept curled around a crayon she had refused to put down. The red one. Always the red one. Her breathing slow and precise, even her sleep organized. Ven slept in the center, his mat exactly where Meg had placed it, his body a small warm comma between his siblings. Meg sat in her corner, wrench across her knees, thermal blanket around her shoulders, eyes on the door. She heard them before the lock moved. A faint scraping, electronic, not mechanical. Bypass tools working the outer panel. The Varani operatives were good at their job. They had studied the station's lock architecture, identified the model, and brought equipment calibrated to its specifications. What they had not studied was the 4 extra bolts Meg had installed, which added roughly 40 seconds to the bypass time. 40 seconds was a long time when you were waiting for it. The outer lock clicked. The door slid open 6 inches, the limit of the secondary bolt, and a thin, scaled hand reached through the gap with a second tool. Meg watched the hand work. Steady, precise, unhurried, professional. The secondary bolt gave. The door opened fully. 2 Varani operatives stood in the doorway, slender, compact, scaled in that same matte gray-green as Seth, the color of things that did not want to be seen. They wore no insignia. They carried no weapons visible to the eye. But Meg could see the outline of something at each hip. Soporific gas dispensers, she guessed, based on Vaughn's briefing about Varani non-lethal interdiction tools. The gas would be calibrated for Dralith respiratory systems. The cubs would be unconscious in seconds. The first operative stepped through the door. His foot hit the floor. It stuck. The industrial adhesive sealant Meg had applied to the deck plates in a 3-foot radius inside the entrance was rated for permanent hull repair. It was designed to bond metal to metal under vacuum pressure. On a flat interior floor applied in a thin, even layer and given 3 days to cure, it had the approximate grip strength of a moral conviction. The operative looked down. His foot was glued to the deck. He shifted his weight to pull free, and his other foot touched the sealant line. Stuck. He was pinned, off balance. His center of gravity committed to a forward motion his feet could no longer complete. The second operative walked into the first. There was a brief, undignified collision. 2 professional infiltrators stumbling into each other like tourists hitting a patch of ice. And then the second operative's left foot found the sealant as well. They were stuck, both of them, upright, furious, and approximately as mobile as furniture. Meg stood up from her chair. She had already triggered the silent alarm, a small button on the underside of her chair arm that Vaughn had installed at her request. One of the upgrades she had negotiated the night Raylos told her about the threat. Station security would arrive in 4 to 6 minutes. She had confirmed the response time twice. She did not call out, did not yell, did not do any of the things that the moment seemed to demand. She stepped out of the dark corner and into the dim light, and stood between the operatives and the sleeping area, wrench in her right hand, and waited. The operatives looked at her, at the 5'4", 120-pound human woman standing between them and their objective, armed with a maintenance tool and wearing a thermal blanket like a shawl. The first operative said something in Varani, a short, clipped phrase that Meg's translator rendered as, "It's the soft one." Meg adjusted her grip on the wrench. Behind her, Koth woke up. He woke fast, a predator's waking, 0 to full alert in under a second, every plate flaring, every muscle coiled, his eyes locked on the 2 figures in the doorway. His body did what his body had been built to do. His chest expanded. His jaw opened. The dominance roar that had been his first and only tool for every situation he had ever faced began building in his throat like a train coming down a tunnel. Meg put her hand on his shoulder. "Inside voice," she said. Koth's jaw closed. He looked at her, at the wrench, at the operatives, at the hand on his shoulder that was not shaking, that was steady with the particular steadiness of someone who had already made every decision this moment required, and was now just moving through the steps. He opened his mouth again. The sound that came out was the inside voice, the low, controlled rumble she had taught him in the first week. It filled the room without shattering it. It communicated presence without panic. It said, "I am here, and I am not afraid, and I do not need to scream to prove it." Sayri woke next. No sound, no startle. Her eyes opened, and she was simply awake, fully operational, her gaze sweeping the room in one efficient pass. Door, operatives, stuck feet, Meg, wrench, Koth. Assessment complete. She rose from her mat and moved to Meg's left side, positioning herself in the gap between Meg and the wall. Not behind Meg, beside her, flanking. No training manual existed for this situation. She had simply looked at the geometry of the room, identified where the line of defense was thinnest, and filled it. Ven woke last. He was the smallest. His roar was the weakest. His plates were thin, and his body was not built for the thing that was happening in this room. And every piece of biological programming he had inherited from a million years of jungle evolution was telling him to go to the door, to the exit, to the place where expendable things positioned themselves so the pack could survive. The door was currently occupied by 2 Varani operatives glued to the floor. Ven stood up from his mat, the mat in the center, the mat Meg had moved. He looked at Meg, at Koth rumbling his inside voice, at Sayri holding the flank. He walked forward, past Koth, past Sayri, past Meg. He stopped 3 feet from the operatives, at the edge of the sealant line, close enough to see the confusion and anger in their flat black eyes, and he opened his mouth. The roar was not loud, it was not deep, it did not rattle the walls or flicker the lights, or carry pheromone markers that would trigger prey responses in other species. It was a small, thin sound from a small, thin body, and it would not have intimidated anything in any jungle on any world. But he did it standing in the center of the room, between his siblings and his human, not behind them. And he did not back down. He held the sound, held it past the point where his lungs wanted to quit. Held it while the Varani operatives stared at this absurd little creature roaring at them from the edge of a glue trap. And he did not step back, and he did not make himself small, and he did not go to the door. Station security arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds later. A squad of Keth officers in tactical plating, moving with the efficient violence of a species that did not believe in second chances. The operatives were cut free from the sealant, restrained, and removed. The diplomatic fallout, charges filed, the Varani delegation expelled. Seth's quiet career as a professional threat, suddenly and publicly over, would unfold over the next week. That was politics and paperwork and things that happened in rooms Meg would never enter. What happened in the nursery in the 4 minutes between the alarm and the arrival of security was this. A human woman stood in front of 3 children who were not her species, not her blood, not her responsibility by any biological or contractual definition that mattered. And she held a wrench, and she did not move. And the children lined up beside her, because she had taught them, in the space of 2 weeks, that the center of the room was where you stood, not the door. The delegation's rotation ended 11 days later. Consul Thyan came for the cubs herself. The handoff was formal, procedural, conducted in the brisk manner of a species that did not believe in extended farewells. Koth walked to his mother's side, plates high, posture straight, and then turned and looked at Meg, and produced a low, perfect rumble, inside voice, sustained, deliberate, that Thyan had never heard from him before. She looked at her son, then at Meg. Her expression did not change, but her plates shifted color in a way that Meg had learned to read as recalculation. Sayri left her drawings on the wall, all of them. She walked to the door and stopped, and looked back at the gallery of maps and portraits, and the small drawing in the corner of a figure with no plates and no claws, holding something bright, and she left them there on purpose, and Meg understood. Ven was last. He stood in the center of the room, his spot, the spot that Meg had made his, and he did not move. Thyan called him. Meg knelt down, her bad knee protesting, and put her hands on the soft places between his plates, and said something quiet, something the nursery's audio sensors picked up, but that Meg would never repeat, and that no record would preserve. Ven pressed his face against her neck. One breath, two. He walked to his mother. Thyan paused at the nursery door. She looked at the drawings. She looked at the sleeping mat in the center. She looked at Meg, who was still kneeling on the floor with her hands empty, and her face doing the thing it did when she was holding everything inside with both fists. Thyan produced a sound. Not a roar, not a word, a low, resonant hum that started in her chest and moved through the floor and up through Meg's knees and into her body like a second heartbeat. It lasted 3 seconds. Then Thyan left, and the cubs were gone, and the nursery was empty. Meg stayed on the floor for a while. Vaughn found her later. She asked him about the sound. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that his mandibles stopped clicking entirely, which Meg had never heard before. "It is a recognition," he said, "given to one who has no blood claim to the pack, but has earned the right to remain, one who was given the door and chose not to leave." Meg nodded, looked at the wall, at Sayri's drawings, at the block fortress half-built, listing to the left, waiting for someone to add the next piece. She pulled out her tablet, called Lizzie. It rang twice. Lizzie picked up. There was noise in the background, a kitchen, a life, a world that was 600 million miles away and still running on coffee and Tuesday mornings. "Hey," Lizzie said, "how are you really doing?" Meg opened her mouth. The nursery was empty. The drawings were on the wall, somewhere on a ship pulling away from the station. A small cub with thin plates and a weak roar was sleeping. And he was not sleeping by the door. "Lizzie," Meg said,